Joining us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, also NBC's Vaughn Hilliard from West Palm Beach, Florida, and Mimi Rocha, district attorney for Westchester County in New York and former federal prosecutor. So, Lisa, what exactly do we know about how Judge Merchan reached his decision?
Well, Jose, we don't know that much about what factors went into this decision, in part because Judge Merchan left us only a one-page guide to his thinking. But I can tell you substantively what he has decided. He will hear a motion to dismiss the entire indictment from Trump's lawyers, and he will receive that brief on December 2nd. That's 18 days before Todd Blanche and his colleagues proposed submitting a brief to Judge Merchan. They really wanted this briefing schedule on the motion to dismiss potentially to bleed into former President and President-elect Trump's new term in the Oval Office, because at that point he would be sitting President Trump, and the constitutional issues that could underlie there being an existing case against him might be very different in terms of how courts weigh those factors once he's back in the Oval Office. So here, Judge Merchan telling Trump's lawyers, put in your brief by December 2nd. He's telling the DA, I will take your opposition on December 9th. That is the same day that the DA's office originally proposed to oppose it. He is not allowing reply briefs, which means he is seemingly preparing to issue a decision, perhaps sometime before the holidays. And in calling off the sentencing, Jose, the other thing that comes to my attention is he's saying, I'm calling off the sentencing only to the extent that it was scheduled for next week. What he's not doing is saying the sentencing is postponed indefinitely. Only I'm calling off the November 26th date. What does that mean to me? That means we could get a ruling from Judge Merchan, both on the motion to dismiss and the underlying motion to set aside the verdict. I can see a world in which Judge Merchan says, not only am I not going to dismiss the indictment, but I believe the conviction should stand, and I am either prepared to postpone the sentencing until Trump is no longer president after his next term, or I may even be prepared to sentence him now to something like time served and excuse him from having to attend in person, Jose.
Mimi, what's your reaction to this? And, you know, as Lisa was saying, it's really just a one-page statement, but what does that statement tell you?
Well, I think Lisa's got it exactly right. You know, there's the judge is doing exactly, frankly, what one would expect a reasonable judge to do in this situation, which is to say we have to go forward with briefing on this very important legal issue about, you know, whether or not he can proceed with the sentencing. And whether, you know, the verdict should stand. I think the judge, you know, then, as Lisa laid out so thoughtfully, has options in terms of going. Look, I'm assuming the judge will find that the verdict will stand and that sentencing should be proceeded with either after Trump is done being president again, or immediately, and it'll be some sentence that is able to be reconciled with him being president. I say that not because I'm, you know, predicting what the judge would do, but just that seems like the reasonable outcome in this case. And so, I think, once again, it's a small step, but it is a step of the system continuing to function and work as best it can under these extraordinary circumstances. And we can't lose sight of the fact that whatever happens, he was found guilty by a jury of essentially his peers, of regular people. And at the end of the day, as a prosecutor, I look at that as the most important part of this process.
I want to bring in MSNBC legal analyst Catherine Christian, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney. Catherine, good morning. So your thoughts first on what this is. And, you know, Mimi and Lisa were talking about the possible outcomes or decisions that Merchan could make. What do you see here?
I think, and this is reading tea leaves, but I think if Judge Merchan was going to set aside the verdict, he would have done so already. That he is allowing the defense to file a motion to dismiss, and under New York law, that's considered it's called a Clayton motion, a motion to dismiss in the interest of justice, because the facts and circumstances cry out that this case should be dismissed. I don't think Judge Merchan will do that. I think he is being courteous and careful in allowing the defense to file their motion, allowing the prosecutors, the people in the state, we're called the people, not the government, to respond. It was noted that he said no replies will be allowed after. So defense files, prosecution files, that's it, and he'll make a decision. So, and as Lisa said, and his decision could be not dismissing the indictment, not set aside the verdict. I'm going to sentence President-elect Trump, time served, which means no jail, no probation, and then goodbye, go talk to the appellate courts.
So, and I'm just wondering, Catherine, what were his options before Donald Trump became president-elect and will in January be president, in the sense of what are the possible things that Merchan could have sentenced Trump to if it weren't such an unusual case?
If Donald Trump did not win, he would just be citizen Trump, and the sentencing would go on next week. And the judge could sentence him anywhere from nothing up to 4 years. There are 34 counts. They're all the same count, falsifying business records in the first degree. It can't be consecutive, meaning it can't be 4 years plus 4 years plus 4 years. So those would be the options: probation, a conditional discharge, the condition being you have to pay a fine, or a sentence of imprisonment. That is off the table now because we now have President-elect Trump.
Vaughn, what are you hearing from President-elect Trump's team this morning?
So far, nothing in these first few minutes since his decision came down. But I think that this is, as Catherine was just suggesting, right, 3 weeks ago, it was the stakes of this election were so high because instead of Todd Blanche and Emile Bove being concerned or too highly concerned about their client, the defendant Trump, potentially being sentenced next week just before Thanksgiving to jail time, they have been promised to be nominated to be the number 2 and number 3 position holders within the Department of Justice in his administration come January of 2025. And so I think that there is a lot at stake still here, as everybody was just outlining, for Donald Trump and his legal team, especially with January 20th inauguration on the horizon. Of course, there's a question if Judge Merchan were to indefinitely postpone the sentencing after Donald Trump's prison or after his presidential term, meaning that a sentence wouldn't take place more likely until 2029 or later, it would effectively leave a cloud over the course of his presidency. We should note, of course, just 2 weeks ago, he had seemingly in jest suggested that he would not run for president again. But I think for Donald Trump and his legal team, they effectively were able to run out the clock, understanding that the Supreme Court's immunity decision was paramount to their ability to doing so, and they're now here at a point in time where they're going to have their motion to dismiss, and the potential here that they could get a sentence that is just time served, and potentially Donald Trump enters the White House on January 20th with this case while still having been found guilty and being a convicted felon, at least knowing that the case and the potential consequences and repercussions of that guilty conviction being behind him.
I'm just wondering, Lisa, I mean, if that is, for example, the case, if you were to be found guilty, as he was, but I mean, he'd be entering, as Vaughn says, entering the White House as a convicted felon. I mean, that changes so many things.
It certainly does, Jose, in the public imagination. But of course, Trump had been convicted on 34 felony counts before the election. And the fact that he hadn't been sentenced yet, and that's really the only remaining step here, I'm not sure how much that changes. The one thing I would caution everybody is that while Merchan may be setting this up so that he can proceed to a sentencing, there is an argument that former and future President Trump's lawyers have about how to avoid sentencing. And they still have an appeal and the federal appeals court with respect to their trying to move this case back to federal court on the ground that Trump is a former federal officer. And of course, he will be a federal officer again, and that they have federal defenses to articulate. They tried that a couple of months ago in the federal courts here in Manhattan, and they were rejected by a judge. But they've got an appeal that's still pending. The DA's brief in that appeal is due in mid-January. And so if there are signs that Judge Merchan is going to proceed to sentencing, watch for them to rush to that federal court and ask for immediate relief, because the federal statute essentially says if you are trying to remove a state criminal case, you cannot proceed to sentencing. And that is what former and future President Trump's lawyers are counting on in terms of trying to make an argument up through the federal appeal system, potentially up through the Supreme Court, Jose.
And you're saying mid-January by that decision? That would be, and is it before the 20th?
Not mid-January before the decision, mid-January in terms of when the Manhattan DA's brief is due.
Right.
And so if Judge Merchan is trying to move to a decision on sentencing or indicates he's willing to do so before the inauguration, before that brief, count on the Trump lawyers to rush to the Second Circuit. That's the U.S. Court of Appeals that oversees Manhattan and New York, Vermont, Connecticut, and make an argument that he can't proceed to sentencing while that appeal is still pending, because that federal statute says if you are trying to move it to federal court on the grounds that you are a former or future president and you've got some federal defenses in your back pocket, it's unlawful to proceed to sentencing. That's something that they are hoping to be able to articulate to a federal appeals court sometime soon, Jose.